Hi, welcome to the History Talks. I'm your host, Will, and this is Sebastian. In this episode, we're going to be continuing our discussion on Otto von Bismarck. If you missed our first episode on Otto von Bismarck, the link is in the description below. So, Sebastian, we left off at Otto von Bismarck's role in German unification. So,
Correct.
tell us, what did he do from that point on?
So, so first I'd like to discuss the constitution of this new German state, which was mostly copied from the previous, Prussian North German constitution. The main thing is that there is a supreme leader called the Chancellor, which can veto any legislation from any houses of parliament, and is directly appointed by the Kaiser, with no one who can remove them except for the Kaiser. That the first chancellor, just so happens, was Otto von Bismarck. He carves out this role for himself in the Constitution, so he can, have powers that aren't relying on popular opinion.
Okay, so when he crafted this, did he model it upon any historical figure or historical role?
From what I can tell, he mostly just wanted an executive position that allowed him to use executive powers while still, keeping elements of the previous constitution that were popular.
Okay, that makes sense. So it wasn't he wasn't completely scrapping everything. He was keeping the good parts, revising the bad parts, giving himself a role where he could implement his vision.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the first important thing is, and I believe this is 1872 that this starts. So the Pope declares papal infallibility because of some other theological stuff. Now, Bismarck was always not the most trustful of Catholics. He himself was a Lutheran, and now he's wondering, papal infallibility. Does that mean that that the papacy can turn the German Catholics against me? Which, I mean, because 1/3 of Germany.
Well, let's stop right there. What is papal infallibility exactly? Can you just give a brief description of it?
Basically, it's the doctrine that what the Pope says goes, and unless some other Pope says no, that was wrong. Generally, if the Pope says it's right, at least in the Catholic Church.
Okay. All right. What other Pope? I didn't know there's more than one.
What?
You said unless some other Pope says it's wrong.
Yeah, as in like if a Pope dies and then the next Pope who succeeds him.
They can't contradict a prior.
Or the contradicting a prior Pope is the only way to reject a papal doctrine.
Okay. All right. So anyway, that gives us a brief description. So back on to where you were.
Yes. So in Bismarck's mind, this is a problem because 1/3 of Germany is Catholic, and that Catholic third happens to be areas that had traditionally been under Austrian influence. Areas like Bavaria. So Bismarck, he wants to help keep this German national identity, and above all, he wants to have it so that Germans' loyalty is to Germany above any other loyalty, because that's how he keeps his nation united. So in 1872 he starts a Kulturkampf, as it's called, literally cultural struggle, where he starts cracking down on Catholicism and also socialism, specifically social democracy, because out of all the political parties in Germany, the one Bismarck disliked the most was the Social Democratic Party. He felt that it was a threat to German nationalism.
Okay, so just to go over that again. So Otto von Bismarck was a nationalist.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to suppress Catholicism because he was concerned there may be a conflict with papal influence, which was coming from Rome, it was coming from outside of Germany. And he also had a problem with social democracy. Was social democracy associated with any type of internationalism? Is that why?
He just some versions of it were, but in general, he found that the principles of social democracy to be, anti-authority and anti-conservative, which is, not what he wanted.
Okay, so it was associated with the progressive movement of the time. Is that
Yeah.
why? Okay, I see.
Yeah. So Bismarck, he begins his crackdowns, and however, his approach to the Social Democrats is interesting because not only does he, suppress them, he gets Parliament to pass a law that literally just bans there from being a social democratic or a socialist party. But in addition, he also starts to pass some laws that seem like they're trying to compromise with the Social Democrats at the same time as when he is, suppressing them. So for example, he passes an auto insurance law, and when he's and during the debate to get this law passed in the Reichstag, Bismarck delivers a speech where he says, if your problem is that you want to call my laws socialist, then I do not fear that at all. For any law that helps the people is socialism. The only question should be the limits of state socialism, which it's better than what's happening in France, where they decide that every French citizen has the right to starve. So
Okay, but that's interesting. You said he was able to pass some sort of he was able to outlaw the social democratic party, at least to a
yes,
certain extent, or was he able to, which is the exact opposite of what they have in 2020, right now they have nationalist parties are outlawed, and the by a party that would be associated more with a social democratic type ideology is in power right there. So that's really interesting. And what year are we talking about this?
So this is like 1870s.
Okay, so it took a little over, or what did it take? I guess it was after World War II. But so basically, they completely flipped in their political orientation there. That's interesting.
Yeah. However, in many ways, Bismarck's crackdowns were, unsuccessful, and he eventually had to call the whole culture comp thing off by, I believe, 1874.
Oh, okay. Why was that?
One, instead of ensuring Catholic loyalty to Germany, it instead basically reinforced whatever fear any Catholics might have had that their religion would be persecuted and actually decrease their loyalty,
Okay.
leading to the creation of the Zentrumspartei, which literally translates as Center Party, but was basically everyone knew that was basically the Catholic Party.
Okay.
Also, his crackdowns on social democrats.
And do you know have any idea what percentage of Germans were Catholic at this time?
About 32-33%.
Okay, so about a third of the population. And the rest was predominantly Lutheran. Is that correct?
Or various types of Protestant, but Lutheran was the main.
Popular.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and on the social democratic hand, his crackdowns actually weren't completely helpful in reducing social democratic leadership. In fact, it just kind of made the leaders more angry and more radicalized. And by the end of Bismarck's reign, they would be I think 30% of Germans were part of the Social Democratic Party by the end of Bismarck's reign.
And how were they became more radicalized because they used his suppression of them as a catalyst to be able to say, hey, we have to resist. Is that why?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that was not very successful, but he did get some interesting laws passed. So, like health insurance bills and whatnot.
Okay. Like what sort of health insurance policy did he implement?
I don't fully understand it. I have to go back and do more research to find the exact details.
That's okay.
But generally, he started to implement more public insurance policies while also, letting private institutions do their thing.
Okay.
So yeah. So Bismarck isn't just focusing on domestic policy. He also has so with foreign policy, he needs to make sure that no one is angry at Germany, or at least not enough people are angry at Germany to pose a threat, because if you think about this in the minds of the leaders of the other European nations, um, these 39 states with each with an industrial economy had just unified into a single nation with, at least from an outside perspective, a strong semblance of unity. That's scary if you're a foreign power, especially if you're, say, Britain, who has predominantly, up until this point, used the fact that they kind of invented the Industrial Revolution to dominate the global market. Now, Bismarck's Germany might offer a little more competition, let's just say.
Okay, so the threat to Britain was not a military threat at this point, it was an economic threat.
Yeah, Britain's on an island, and so the only way that Germany could pose that much of a military-based threat is if they went for colonies. So one of Bismarck's plans to make sure that Britain,
Right, because the airplanes have not come into existence.
yeah, not until 1904.
Right.
So
Okay.
so so Britain so Britain, they, for a long time, they've had this sort of detached policy from politics where they would, like, basically what they would do is they would form a temporary alliance if someone seemed to you know mess up the balance of power, start forming coalitions, which sometimes that resulted in things like the Crimean War, and sometimes that resulted in things like Belgium being a separate country from the Netherlands. So Britain was, they didn't really care for France. They had that historical rivalry thing, but they might be willing to ally with France in order to stop Germany.
Oh, so that's pretty serious. I think the tension, the long running rivalry between England and France
Yeah.
is very deep. So for them to want to ally, they must have really seen
Yeah.
Germany as a serious threat at this point.
Yeah, so Bismarck's main goals are to smooth things out with the other powers, get strong enough alliances that he could potentially win a war if war ever came. Though more importantly, he wanted to remove the possibility of war through a mixture of, deterrence via strong alliances and just making the idea of a German nation state seem like a natural thing rather than just this thing that has popped into existence out of thin air.
Okay. And what form of what types of alliances did he come up with that were intended to? I think we know, or we can discuss in another one, how some of the alliances may have actually led to World War One, but at the time the intent was to create such a strong alliance that nobody would want to wage war.
Yeah.
So what sort of alliances did he go after with that goal in mind?
So he mainly wanted an alliance with Russia, but he also kind of wanted an alliance with Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary, having their power base in the Balkans and all of their interests in there, was willing to forgive the Austro-Prussian War and make an alliance with Germany if it meant they could, have more power. Russia had generally friendly relations with Germany up until this point, and they had some conflict with Britain over Afghanistan. So they were happy to ally with Germany. The only problem was that Austria and Russia were not happy to ally with each other because they had conflicting interests in the Balkans. Russia wanted to take advantage of the recent pan-Slavism movement and various nationalist movements in the Balkans to try to increase the Russian sphere of influence and take advantage of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Austria also wanted to do this, except instead of Russian influence, they wanted to increase their own influence. So, as you can understand, there was a bit of conflict between Austria and Russia. So even though they both wanted alliances with Germany, they did not want alliances with each other. So Bismarck needed to manage this because he felt that if he had alliances with both of these countries, his eastern front would be completely secure. So any potential war would just be, an easy conflict on the western front.
I see. Okay.
So he creates the Three Emperors League. named after the fact that Russia is a tsardom, Austria is an empire, Germany's the Kaiserreich, and it's basically the whole goal of this alliance is, if anyone attacks Germany, if anyone messes with these empires, they're going to defend each other. But there were some problems, namely that France was also courting Russia, because France never forgave Germany for taking Alsace-Lorraine, and they never would, for hundreds of years, or 100 years anyway. Like, France was just absolutely livid with Germany. So France.
Let's go. When you say France, is this specifically the ruling class of France, or is this a populist movement?
Oh,
the people of France as a whole just feel betrayed in this
Yes.
matter. That's what it was.
Yeah, because Alsace-Lorraine had for hundreds of years been a core part of France. Sure, it spoke German, but it had de jure been considered part of France. So for this new state that just popped out of thin air in their minds to have the gall to invade France, win, and take this core piece of French territory and claim, oh, well, they're Germans, that was unacceptable to the French people.
What about? Do you know about the people who lived there? The people who lived in this region? Did they associate with? I mean, if they are German speaking, did they associate with Germany more?
They had some association with Germany, but the fact that
they considered themselves French even though they spoke German.
For a long time, yeah.
Okay.
They were okay with living in Germany. They didn't have any problems with that. But if France were to come back, they would not have any problems with that either.
Okay.
So kind of ties both ways.
Okay.
So one of the goals of the French government, who is currently in the Third French Republic, is to court Russia and Britain to try to form some sort of alliance against Germany. Britain, they're kind of scared of Germany, but at this point, Germany had not been, doing anything with their colonies, and Britain had a historic policy of not remaining too attached. So Britain was like, we'll calm down this historic rivalry and have at least some alliance in theory, but unless neutrality is violated, or we really think the balance of power is just going to totally shift, we're just going to remain at least officially neutral.
Okay.
Russia, however, seems a little receptive to France. After all, Austria has no potential allies aside from Germany, so we're not scared of them, and plus France has been investing money into us because Russia, despite their immense population and land, they had been a technological backwater, to be frank, or compared to the rest of Europe. Maybe compared to the rest of Asia or Africa, they were certainly ahead, but compared to Europe, they had barely industrialized. Their rifles were the opposite of top of the line, and all they had was a bunch of bodies they could throw at an enemy. So for France to invest money into Russia, whereas Bismarck had a hard time convincing German investors to do the same, Russia was pretty receptive to this whole France thing. And plus, Germany was courting Britain to at least get them neutral. You never know. Maybe a French alliance would not be so bad. So Russia is leaning towards France, which is Bismarck's greatest fear, but there's not much he can do about it. So then colonial prospects start to pop up around the 1880s. So for the longest time, in order to appease Britain, Bismarck has been avoiding colonialism. Scramble for Africa has been happening, but that's mainly Britain and France's game. One potential colonist infamously went to Bismarck and was like, hey, here's a map of Africa. We could probably take these regions and make lots of money. And Bismarck was like, okay, well here, and he just pulls out a map of Europe and says, "This is my map of Africa because this is where Germany's future lays."
Hmm.
But then, a couple things. But then one particular thing happened. The Belgian Congo's, the real story of the Belgian Congo was leaked because basically King Leopold II, I want to say, of Belgium had basically created a company or officially a charity to stake out a large land in Africa where there were plenty of rubber trees so they could have rubber plantations, officially under the premise of making a charity where they could bring civilization and technology to these poor, unenlightened savages. And at first, everyone believed him, oh, this is just a charity, it's going to be good for the people, more than likely he's going to lose all his money doing this, but good for him. But then the Belgian Congo starts making profit, and everyone's like, wow, okay, maybe this is a good venture. Then people find out what's really going on down there, which is harsh rubber plantations, people getting their hands chopped off, and hand necklaces as a deterrent to make sure people don't revolt or slack off. It was terrible. Women were aborting their children just so that they wouldn't have to grow up in a terrible place like that. It was awful.
Is it also? I mean, I've heard stories like that. Is it also possible that the parts of Africa that were colonized ended up having a better standard of living for the average citizen? Is there any possibility of that?
I find it very unlikely because they did develop because you could argue that some of the infrastructure they added might have helped them in the long term, but at the same time, the population fell and lots of people were left just without hope. So,
I'm saying if you look at what the standard of living was before colonization, or in the parts that were not colonized, and compare that to the standard of living during colonization or after colonization, I wonder how those compare.
From what I can tell, life was generally, better in a lot of ways prior to colonization. It was certainly a lot less technology, but given the technology, it was, an okay standard of living given the primitive technology.
Okay, so you had some I mean, from my understanding, there are tribes. There are various tribes there. There was a
Yeah.
high level of violence among tribes, but you would say that may have been a better standard of living than having bringing other standards. I mean, people have made arguments either way.
Yeah.
Right? But I'm just curious if you had any kind of point of view on that.
I mean, if you basically, if you want to look at that part of Africa prior to colonization, basically think of Europe before the Romans, outside of Greece and stuff. Think of pre-Iron Age Europe, and that's kind of like it was, but with a totally different culture. Right. So
yeah, there's various arguments because life could have, in many cases, was very very short, brutal. There was these constant warring tribes. So to go in and force enslave a group is obviously not a good thing. That's a bad thing. But on the other hand, looking at the standards of the day, colonization versus not being colonized, you could make arguments over which standard of living is actually better for the average person. But we don't need to get into that here. This is about Otto von Bismarck. We can save that for another episode.
Yeah. So basically, people's reaction to this is, in many ways they are appalled, but some people, are thinking, maybe that's how they made so much profit out of the Congo. So maybe it is actually profitable to go for these African colonies and take the land and the people there and incorporate them into our empire, whether that be through protectorates or otherwise. So and later and 2 years after this gets released, the Parliament of Belgium basically makes a law saying okay, we're taking this land directly. It's no longer your personal private property, Leopold.
Okay. But anyway, the way that this all relates back, because that was Belgium, right? The way
Yeah.
that this all relates back to Otto von Bismarck is he was inspired by the Belgian Congo. Is that correct?
Or Europe as a whole was inspired by the
Europe as
Belgian
a whole
Congo.
was inspired, but specifically, what did it make Otto von Bismarck do?
It made him consider the prospect of African colonization seriously for the first time,
Okay.
and also gave him an idea. So in 1885, I want to say, he creates the Congress of Berlin. You may have heard of this before. Basically, what he does is he gathers all of the major European powers, everyone who has a chance at colonizing, and he basically is like, all right, I'm hosting this conference in Berlin, so that he gets a little leverage. And basically, what we're going to do is we're going to draw lines on this map to decide who gets to colonize what parts of Africa.
Okay.
Now, people have criticized this up and down in all sorts of ways, mainly because the lines they drew had no reference for the actual people groups there, so a lot of tribes were split up and stuff like that.
Okay.
But the point,
Or a lot of the tribes nomadic at the time.
depending on what part of Africa you're talking about.
But when they were designing this map, they were probably looking at the resources. For example,
Definitely.
What can we get out of
Yeah,
it?
the main two things they were looking at is the resources there and what colonies there already were.
Okay.
Because people had outposts there for a long time. They had already started, expanding there. So like stuff like the British Royal Niger Company and other things like that.
Okay.
And especially with the invention of, I believe it's called quinine, which is basically a treatment for a strain of malaria that, by that point, most Africans had become immune, but the Europeans had been barred from colonization for a while because of a lack of immunity.
I see.
So, they come in and because it's in Berlin, Bismarck manages to get enough leverage, and because they are doing it at a conference, manages to soothe Britain enough that he manages to get away with some colonies, mainly Benin, Tanganyika, which is basically modern day Tanzania, minus Zanzibar, and Namibia. So those all become German colonies.
Okay, and this is in the mid 1880s.
Yes.
Okay, so so Bismarck is involved in the colonization of Africa, and how does that go? Is that successful for Germany? Is it?
They successfully get the territory, though it's disputable whether it was actually, completely profitable for Germany.
Okay.
At the very least, it did make them some amount of money, and it did gain them some amount of influence over the oceans, increasing their naval presence. Now, Germany increasing its naval presence some scared Britain some, especially since now they were starting to look at Pacific colonies and maybe intervening in China. But though they would be happy about intervening in China during the Boxer Rebellion. But Britain's still getting a little scared, but because he did have this Congress and is able to make the proper compromises with Britain, they're not so scared that they're just going to straight up join a coalition.
Okay, so Bismarck starts the colonies. How long do the colonies go on, or how long does this colonization go on for in Africa?
Germany's colonies, they keep these colonies until the end of World War One.
Okay.
The rest of the European powers keep them until like a few years after World War II.
Oh, okay, so Germany's presence, it sounds like it may have come a little later than other European nations. Their colonization,
or it was cut a little short, more like.
It was cut short. Okay, so maybe it began at the same time, but it was cut short. They pulled out, so it probably was not very profitable for them.
Yeah, because they were forced to pull out after World War One.
Oh, they were forced to. What, as part of a treaty?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
But that's later on.
Okay, so that's later on, right? We're going a couple decades down the road. So Otto von Bismarck, 1885. When does his career end? Around around 1890?
1890, it all
Okay.
starts to come crashing
Yeah,
down.
so let's talk about what happens during those last few years.
So first, Kaiser Wilhelm I dies. He's replaced with Frederick III, who doesn't really do anything. He dies within like a year. But then Kaiser Wilhelm II comes to power. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm II is sympathetic to some of the liberals, domestic policies, though still likes autocracy. Though he has many conflicts with Bismarck over a host of different things, Bismarck is trying his hardest to keep both Austria-Hungary and Russia on Germany's side. As far as Wilhelm II is concerned, it's not worth it to put all this into a Russian alliance. You might as well just grab the Italian alliance, and and they just generally don't like each other. And when Russia finally decides, all right, I'm allying with France, Bismarck's worst nightmares become realized, because that is the thing he works so long to prevent. The enemies on both sides of Germany, the possibility of a two-front war. And he knew a two-front war was coming. In 1880, he said, the Great European War will start with some damn foolish thing in the Balkans. So, he knew something was coming.
Okay, wow, okay. He could sense it was on the horizon, huh?
Yeah.
Even though it didn't. And how long did he live?
He lived until 1898.
1898, okay, so his career ended around 1890. He still lived. So he did not live. And what year did World War I start?
1914.
1914, okay, so he did not see. He even died, 16 years before the start of World War I, but he could, and even a couple decades before then, 2 or 3 decades before, he could see it coming. He could see the tension building. Okay.
Yeah.
And at that point, he was hoping he could come up with these alliances, which would either maybe he knew it was unpreventable, but maybe he was simply said, I can't prevent this conflict from happening, but I can try to strengthen Germany's position as much as possible. So that's the position he was coming from, and that's really, is that how he ended his career? He had started out the colonization. He had been arranging foreign alliances, but it sounds like at home, in his domestic policy, there was some pushback against him because he tried to suppress the Social Democrats.
Yeah.
That only energized them further. He tried to suppress the Catholics. That only energized them further. Mm-hmm. So he was having trouble at home. At the same time, he was trying to extend Germany's wealth out through colonization, which may have been somewhere between neutral to a slight gain for them.
Yeah.
And then he was trying to form alliances, which I think we know didn't end up working out so well for him. But I guess and kind of to end this episode, let's say if he could have done things differently, if he could have arranged alliances differently, could he have come up with any better alliances, or did he, given the position where the forces so aligned against Germany, did he do the best? Did he come up with the best alliances he possibly could, or is there anything he could have done better?
I'm not sure. He may very well have come up with the best alliances. He might have been able to do something with Japan, who had some conflict with Russia, but
interesting. Japan, even in World War I, he could have involved them. You think?
Yeah, because in real life World War I, Japan actually joined Britain's side so that they could get some German islands in the Pacific.
Okay, all right. So you're thinking that's really probably the only thing he could have done.
Yeah, and even then, for all the good that would have done.
Yeah, that may have. So he may have actually done the best he possibly could given his position. They were just the odds were so stacked against them. There's nothing he could have done.
Yeah. So by the time Russia allies themselves with France, and Wilhelm II is having his whole thing, Bismarck, in 1890 he retires. He feels like he's failed Germany, but he's done the best he could.
Mm.
He has one last meeting with Wilhelm II, and he says this: so long as you have your current, supporting people, you may do as you please, but at some point, it will be very different for you. Just as the Battle of Vienna was 20 years after the death of Frederick the Great, so will your fall come 20 years after my own death.
Hmm.
Bismarck died in 1898. The German Empire fell in 1918, with Wilhelm II being forced to abdicate under mounting pressure from both his officer corps and from the Entente, who was pushing back against Germany. Bismarck's prediction was only off by 4 months.
Wow, that's quite prescient then. So
Yeah.
that's a good synopsis of the end of his career there. Or did you have any final words you wanted to say about Otto von Bismarck?
Just a really funny quote. He once said that God has a special providence for fools and for the United States of America. I don't remember the context of that quote.
Yeah.
But here's another quote on a bit more serious note that a lot of people say sums up his career. The great questions of the day will not be decided by great speeches and debates. That was the mistake of 1848, but by iron and blood.
All right.
Yeah.
It's a good quote.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Sebastian. That was a good explanation of the life of Otto von Bismarck,
Yep.
and I hope everybody listening enjoyed it. And we will see you next time on the History Talks.
Bye.